Henry VIII is best remembered throughout history for the fact that he had 6 wives, but 2 of these women were executed inside the walls of the Tower of London, the infamous and brutal prison that sits on the banks of the River Thames. But these 2 wives were not the only 2 women put to the sword by the notorious Tudor King. He was not afraid to turn on anyone, and many people feared for their lives, and the king had some women even subjected to the most harrowing execution methods of being burned at the stake and boiled alive. This is the story of those women who were executed by the notorious Tudor King, and in this documentary we will look at each of the women and their lives. When Richard Roos was condemned to death, the king actually changed the laws and rules of his kingdom to allow someone who was suspected of poisoning to be executed by boiling alive. It was said by Henry VIII himself in a speech that His Highness, considering the man's life above all things, is chiefly to be favoured, and voluntary murders most highly to be detested and abhorred, and specially all kinds of murders poisoning, which in this realm hereto the Lord be thanked hath been most rate and seldom committed or practised. He then pushed through a new law allowing the sentence for poisoning to be boiling alive. This specific law claimed that the said poisoning be adjudged high treason, and that the said Richard Roos, for the said murder and poisoning of the said 2 persons, shall stand and be attainted of high treason, and shall be therefore boiled to death without benefit of clergy, and that in future murder by poisoning shall be adjudged high treason, and the offender, deprived of his clergy, be boiled to death. When Richard Roos's case was one which was symbolic, with him being lowered into a boiling pot representing his act of introducing poison to food, or whether Richard Roos was mocked as he was a cook, it is not known, but his execution was harrowing, and he was boiled in a broth at Smithfield inside of a cauldron, and he was lowered, in it's believed, 3 times before he was killed. It was stated by witnesses that he roared mighty loud, and divers women who were big with child did feel sick at the sight of what they saw, and were carried away half dead. And other men and women did not seem frightened by the boiling alive, but would prefer to see the headsman at his work. But he was not the only victim of Henry VIII to be boiled alive, and there was actually a woman who was subjected to this execution method. In the year 1542, a woman named Margaret Davy was accused of the crime of poisoning for her employer. It was claimed that to kill a man by poison is the most detestable of all, because it is most horrible and fearful to the nature of man, and of all others can be least prevented either by manhood or providence. This offence was so odious that by Act of Parliament it was made high treason, and it inflicted a more grievous and lingering death than the common law prescribed. That the offender shall be boiled to death in hot water, upon which statute Margaret Davy, a young woman, was attainted of high treason for poisoning her mistress and some others, was boiled to death in Smithfield, the 17th of March in the same year. With this, it tells us that the last documented execution by boiling alive was of this woman, Margaret Davy. She was, as mentioned, accused of poisoning a woman who employed her and others, and with this was tried. Henry VIII was himself terrified of poisoning, and he even employed a taste tester to try his food. Margaret Davy was a maidservant who was accused of poisoning 3 people in the house where she lived. She was, on the day of her execution, taken to Smithfield, the same place where Richard Roos had been executed years before, and was then boiled alive in a huge pot in front of a crowd. There were only a few accounts of this execution method being carried out, and later during the reign of Edward VI, the law was then repealed, and no one was ever boiled inside of a cauldron again at Smithfields for their actions. Margaret Davy's story is one which is not the most known about, but We know that she was found guilty of poisoning 3 people, and for this she paid the ultimate price by being boiled alive in front of a crowd in London in one of the most harrowing and barbaric ways possible.
There were a number of incredibly high-profile people executed by Henry, including 2 of his wives, his closest friends, and also his advisors. He tried to also eliminate any possible threat to his throne that may have existed, and one woman who met an incredibly bloody fate inside the walls of the Tower of London was Margaret Pole, the Countess of Salisbury. Even despite being executed at the age of 67, Henry deemed her as a threat due to her links to the House of York. Margaret was born on the 14th of August 1473 in Farleigh Castle in Somerset. She was the only surviving daughter of George Plantagenet, the Duke of Clarence, and his wife Isabel Neville, who was the oldest daughter of the Earl of Warwick, Richard Neville, also known as Warwick Kingmaker. So Margaret was born into the House of York, and in particular the ruling royal family. George, after plotting a number of times against the king, was arrested and indicted on treason and was sentenced to death. George's death in particular was very savage, being drowned inside a barrel of Malmsey wine. Whilst inside the Tower of London, it was clear that Edward had enough of his brother, and to sentence him to death in this way was rather brutal. However, before this took place, Isabel Neville, Margaret's mother, passed away when she was 3 years old. Her father believed that one servant had poisoned her, and because of this, servants were killed, but within 2 years her father was also dead, and Margaret was left without any parents. Her father's lands and titles were taken because of the circumstances of his death, but when Margaret was 10, King Edward IV, her uncle, passed away. Following this, Richard III seized the throne, following the disappearance of the princes in the Tower, and subsequent rumoured murder of them, and Richard ordered a statue that barred Edward's children from the throne, claiming that Edward's marriage was invalid. This secured Richard III on the throne, but subsequently also barred Margaret from the throne. So Margaret's uncle, Richard III, was now ruling, and he sent her to Sheriff Hutton Castle. But following the defeat at the Battle of Bosworth, things changed in England. Henry VII, who had defeated Richard in the deciding Battle of the Wars of the Roses, married Margaret's cousin, Elizabeth of York, to unite the 2 warring sides of the Plantagenet dynasty under the Tudor name. After this, Margaret and her brother Edward were locked away by the couple, but later, Edward, who was considered a Yorkist claimant, was moved to the Tower of London. So Margaret was now being looked after by the new King of England, Henry VII, and in around November of 1487 he gave her hand in marriage to his cousin, Sir Richard Pole. His mother was the half-sister of the king's mother, Margaret Beaufort, and this further strengthened her links to the crown for Henry. Richard and Margaret's marriage reinforced the Tudor alliance between York and Lancaster, and Richard was involved in the king's government and served in a number of roles for Henry VII, including the Chamberlain for his eldest son and heir, Arthur, the Prince of Wales. When Arthur married Catherine of Aragon, Margaret Pole became one of her ladies-in-waiting, but following Arthur's death in 1502, her household was dissolved before she later then married Henry VIII. Richard Pole died around 1505, but despite this their marriage had been fruitful, and the 2 had 5 children together. Richard's death left Margaret a rather penniless widow, with only a small amount of land passed to her. Henry VII paid for Richard's funeral, and things looked dismal for the once former Yorkist claimant to the throne. To help her financial situation, she devoted her 3rd son Reginald to the church, and he later rose to the position of Archbishop of Canterbury. Reginald did dislike the fact his mother seemingly abandoned him, but Margaret was desperate after her husband died. So she had no way to support herself and her children, and even was forced to live inside of Sion Abbey as a guest of the nuns that lived there. She stayed here for a rough 4 years before her fortunes changed significantly. When Henry VIII came onto the throne and married Catherine of Aragon, Margaret's life changed. She must have been liked by Catherine, as Margaret was recalled to become one of her ladies-in-waiting again, and she must have also been liked initially by Henry VIII. In 1512, an Act of Parliament restored Margaret the earldom of Salisbury and some of her brother's lands following his execution, and these were worth around £2 million in modern-day money. Henry VIII had overseen the land for a while, but it was believed that Margaret would take care of them well. She did this and managed them rather successfully, and within decades she had become the 5th richest peer inside of the country. Margaret was a keen learner, and she was also keen to impart the importance of new learning and education onto those around her, including her children. Henry Pole, her eldest son, spoke on behalf of the family inside the House of Lords, and her second son, Arthur, became a prominent courtier, being Gentleman of the Privy Chamber. Reginald Pole also rose to prominence inside of the Catholic Church, but Margaret's favour at court rose and fell over the years. In 1518, she got into an argument regarding land with Henry VIII. In 1520, she became governess to Princess Mary, Henry VIII's eldest daughter. Margaret did stick up for Mary, as when she was declared illegitimate, Margaret refused to give Mary's jewels and gold plate back, and her household was then broken up. It was even suggested that Mary should be handed over to Margaret permanently, but the king regarded her as a fool with no experience to raise her. However, Margaret Pole, along with her son, would fall from grace. In 1531, Reginald Pole, who was rising throughout the Catholic Church, warned and spoke about the dangers of Henry VIII marrying Anne Boleyn. It was suggested that Reginald should have married Princess Mary, later Mary I, to give them both a huge and strong claim to the English throne. Reginald, in the May of 1536, broke from Henry VIII, and this forced Margaret out of court. Following the subsequent downfall of Anne Boleyn and her execution, Margaret did briefly return to the king's court. Reginald became a cardinal in 1537, and he was placed in charge of organising help for the Pilgrimage of Grace, a huge protest against Henry VIII and the dissolution of the monasteries. The English government knew about this and even tried to have Reginald assassinated, but he was involved in organising the papal help to the rebellion. To be associated with Reginald was incredibly dangerous, and his brother Geoffrey was arrested in August of 1538 for writing to him. He was later pardoned. However, Margaret Pole's eldest son Henry was later executed for treason. The huge investigation into anyone corresponding to Reginald Pole saw the downfall of Margaret Pole, his mother, come with devastating fashion. During investigations around Margaret, Thomas Cromwell found a tunic bearing the 5 wounds of the Christ, allegedly belonging to the Countess of Salisbury. This was seen as a key part of evidence, showing Margaret's alleged support for Catholicism and for her son Reginald and the king's Catholic daughter Princess Mary. This was found allegedly 6 months after her house was searched, and it is most probable that this evidence was seen as a false piece and was just plucked out of nowhere. Because of this, Margaret Pole was transported to the Tower of London and would be held here within the walls for 2 years. She was sentenced to death and would be executed at any time that the king saw fit, and this was torture itself, not knowing if her last day was coming or not. At the time of her imprisonment, Margaret was around 65 and was an elderly woman, but she was allowed a large grant of clothing and also a number of servants. Inside the tower she was suffering greatly with the conditions of her imprisonment. On the morning of the 27th of May 1541, Margaret Pole was told that she would die within an hour. She must have known that death was on the horizon, as on the wall of her cell she carved a poem which said, "For traitors on the block should die, I am no traitor, no, not I. My faithfulness stands fast, and so towards the block I shall not go. Nor make me step, as you shall see, Christ in thy mercy, save thou me." She claimed that she had not committed any crime, but it's believed Henry VIII sought to kill Margaret to stamp out any claim she may have had to the throne. Inside the walls of the Tower of London, she was executed, and she was granted the privilege, because of her status and links to the crown, to be executed within the walls rather than being taken to Tower Hill. There are different accounts regarding her execution. However, on Tower Green, a low wooden block had been prepared, rather than a scaffold, and it's believed that simply it just laid on the floor, meaning that Henry probably in some haste ordered her execution, without time for preparation. One account states that the execution took place in a corner of the tower, with hardly any witnesses, which caused doubt that the evening that her execution took place, but another account says 150 people were present. It was said that, at first, when the sentence of death was made known to her, she found the thing very strange, not knowing what crime she was accused, nor how she had been sentenced. It was said that her execution was performed by a wretched and blundering youth. As Margaret Pole allegedly lay her hand on the block, it's believed that she was very defiant, and the inexperienced axeman made a real mess of the job. It's believed that it took a number of swings of the axe to take off her head, and that she turned her head every way. There was a rumour that emerged that following the first swing from the axe, that she leapt up from the block and ran around the Tower of London for her life. The executioner hacked her head and shoulders to pieces, and after the bloody job was done, she was buried inside of the chapel, inside the tower's walls. Margaret Pole lived a very interesting life, in which she was genuinely a claimant to the throne. She rose to prominence and fell a number of times throughout her life. However, today she is regarded as a saint by Catholics. It's believed her execution was a horrific sham that should never have taken place, and it was thought Henry wished to do it to finally stamp out Yorkist claimants to his throne once and for all.
The Tudor period itself was a rather bloody time for people to live within. But inside of Henry's kingdom, it was very dangerous to disagree or dissent against the monarchy. Henry VIII executed around 72,000 people inside of his kingdom during his 4-decade-long reign on the throne. Many of these were criminals, but also those who disagreed with the king. Henry divided the nation in particular a number of times, especially with his reforms to religion and his splitting from the Catholic Church. When Henry was declared the head of the Church of England, he was met with a large amount of opposition, which even resulted in the deaths of some of his closest advisers. However, dissenting and disagreeing with the king would get someone in a lot of trouble, and you could definitely play with your life. Today we look at Elizabeth Barton, who is known as the Nun of Kent, or the Holy Maid of London. She famously had a number of prophecies against the king, and in particular in response to his marriage to his second wife, Anne Boleyn. These visions ultimately cost Elizabeth her life, and resulted in a shocking execution. Elizabeth Barton was born around the year 1506, and not much is known about her early life. It's most probable that she was illiterate and could not read, and that she had no formal education. She was noted in 1525 to have been working as a servant in the household of a man named Thomas Cobb, who himself was a farm manager to the Archbishop of Canterbury, William Warham. She was based in a small village called Aldingham, but in 1535 she was taken very ill. It is said that Elizabeth was touched with a green infirmity in her body, which did ascend at diverse times up into her throat, which swelled greatly, during which she seemed to be in grievous pain, in so much pain as a man would have thought she had been suffered the pangs of death itself, until the disease descended and fell down into the body again. She suffered greatly, but it's during the sickness and delirious that she became to predict a number of events, such as the death of a child who was being cared for. She began to display some supernatural abilities, and it's believed that she did have some sort of epilepsy, which caused her seizures. This also caused her face to have been contorted, and this also causes paralysis. She would fall into a trance and made many predictions and religious statements. She became a nun in 1526 after meeting with a number of monks. In this role, it was said that her visions would attract a huge crowd and thousands of people would come to see what Elizabeth Barton would predict and see. The news of her visions spread quickly across the country, and more people from all over England flocked to see her. Bishop Thomas Cranmer even visited Elizabeth and said how he had seen an incredible miracle created by God, with Barton in a trance for 3 hours with her face wonderfully disfigured.
Cranmer said that whilst in the trance she spoke of the joys of heaven in a sweet voice, but also preached about hell, which struck fear into the audience. Cranmer thought that Barton, in this seizure, was getting a true glimpse of heaven. She began to become known as the Nun of Kent. Such was her popularity, and more influential churchmen visited her. The Archbishop of Canterbury and Bishop John Fisher also saw her here and were impressed, and it was recommended that she visited Cardinal Wolsey. During the meetings with the influential advisor to the Catholic Church and the King of England, Henry VIII, Barton had a vision. She said she saw Wolsey with 3 swords, one showing the Pope's power, another showing his power as Lord Chancellor, and another sword representing the power to grant Henry VIII his divorce to his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. Wolsey, impressed, then arranged for Elizabeth Barton to see the king, and this is where things changed greatly for her. A meeting was set up, and during this Elizabeth told Henry to burn the English translation of the Bible, and also to stick with the Pope and remain loyal to the Catholic faith. She also then said if Henry would marry Anne Boleyn, then he would faithfully die within a month of the marriage, and that in 6 months a great pestilence and plague would hit England, causing devastation across the nation. Henry decided to treat these claims with trepidation, and he warned his closest advisers to keep an eye on Elizabeth Barton. It was claimed by Protestants that her views were the work of the devil, and that she was coerced into speaking against Protestantism and the reforms to religion in England. However, the issue was that Elizabeth Barton freely debated and predicted something incredibly serious, the death of King Henry VIII. Instead of debating religion, this in a sense was treason and very dangerous. Now, following her meeting with the king, she went on tour speaking to large numbers of the population, and people would see her to ask for help with their sins and their health, believing that she could ask God to help the sick and heal them. She warned of the work of Martin Luther, and said that God approved of Catholic practices such as pilgrimages and Mass, but she met the king yet again in October of 1532. She continued to warn Henry VIII of God's discontent with him, and she repeated the remarks about Henry dying within a month of his second marriage should it go ahead. She also claimed he would go to hell, dying a villain. However, at this time, Anne Boleyn would later find out that she was pregnant, and because of this, Henry hastily sorted out his annulment with Catherine of Aragon, and because of the pregnancy, he would marry Anne in secret for fear of his child being illegitimate. Elizabeth Barton was then spoke to strongly by senior members of Henry's court and government, warning that if she continued to speak in the manner about the king as she did, then she would be guilty of treason. Elizabeth refused to stop, and a book was written about her visions, and Thomas Cromwell sought to stop her ideas spreading. He ordered all copies to be destroyed, and later Thomas Cranmer invited her to his manor to question her about her claims, but she was then released. However, she was brought into the Tower of London, with Thomas Cromwell then placing her under arrest and interrogating her. Along with Cranmer and Bishop Hugh Latimer, Cromwell interrogated her to find out what her true messages were. She did repeat that in a final message from a higher authority, God had told her to deny that she had ever had a vision and a revelation of God. Cranmer reported that inside the tower she had confessed and that she had never actually had a religious vision in her life, and that her claims were nothing but lies and figments of her imagination. It's likely that the confines of the Tower of London had ground her down, but also it has been suggested that she was tortured and could have been put onto the rack to inflict pain and punishment to get her to recant her statements. Because of this confession, the king wished for it to be heard in front of a huge crowd, to basically shame and denounce Elizabeth Barton as a fraud. A platform was created at St Paul's Cross, and on the 23rd of November 1553, she was forced to confess her lies in front of a crowd of 2,000 people. She said, "By my falsehood I have deceived all of these people here and many more, whereby I have grievously offended Almighty God, and my most noble sovereign, the King's grace." She was then forced to repeat this across many different towns in England, and Henry forced her to do this as he genuinely feared her visions as a threat to his rule. However, a bill was drawn up that accused Elizabeth Barton and her co-conspirators of treason, and this was passed, and the sentence of this was that many were sentenced to death, including the Nun of Kent, Elizabeth Barton. On the 20th of April 1534, she was dragged through the streets of London from the Tower of London, where she was imprisoned, across the capital to Tyburn. This was a notorious site of execution, where a triangular gallows was even made to execute more people at a quicker speed. She was led up the scaffold and stated to the crowd, which was rather big, "I have not only been the cause of my own death, which most justly I have deserved, but also I am the cause of deaths of all these persons which at the time here suffer. To say the truth, I am not so much blamed, considering it was well known unto these learned men that I was a poor wench without learning, and therefore they might have easily perceived that the things were done by me could not proceed in such sort, but their capacities and learning could right well judge from whence they proceeded. But because these things which I framed was profitable until then, therefore they much praised me, and that it was the Holy Ghost that did them. And then I, being puffed up with their praises, feel a certain pride and foolish fantasy with myself." Before she was killed, Elizabeth Barton admitted that her religious visions had been fraudulent and false, and she blamed her lack of education for this, and also said that many people profited financially from her claims and ideas, and that a business emerged around this. She was then passed over to the executioner, who would take the life of Elizabeth Barton, the Nun of Kent. A huge crowd was there that day, and someone who witnessed the proceedings stated, "This day the Nun of Kent, with 2 friars, observants, 2 monks, and 1 secular priest, were taken from the Tower to Tyburn, and there hanged and beheaded. God, if it be his pleasure, have mercy on their souls. Also this day the most part of this city are sworn to the King and his legitimate issue by the Queen's grace now had here and hereafter to come, and so shall all the realm over the sworn, like in manner." The executions of Barton and the others were clearly meant by the King as a distinct warning to anyone who opposed the King's beliefs, policies, and his changes. To further cement this point, Elizabeth Barton's head was stuck on a spike and left on London Bridge to act as a warning, and she was the only lady to have ever suffered this fate after her execution. So the execution of Elizabeth Barton was incredibly bloody and savage. She was a woman who is believed may have liked the fame, and whether or not she was actually visited by God, the fame that this brought ultimately led to her downfall. Her predictions against the king in particular led her into conflict with the monarchy, and Henry sought to silence her in one of the most barbaric ways possible. It is believed that Alice made acquaintance with 2 foreign merchants and managed to persuade them to take a boat trip with her on the Thames. They rowed the boat to a place known as the Turning Tree, but instead of finding what they thought would be something wonderful, they found John Wolfe waiting for them. There he killed them both in cold blood. Alice and John tied the bodies together and put the 2 merchants into the water. Alice and John then rowed the boat back to the shore and stole 366 gold crowns, a small fortune at the time and worth around £1 million today, from the merchant's room on the ship. Maybe what John and Alice didn't know is that the gold was sent from Europe to help replenish the depleting royal treasury for Henry VIII. The gold was stored in a huge chest and chained with heavy iron chains to the floor of the ship. But to the guards' surprise, it had vanished. A huge investigation was set in motion, and all the evidence, including the fact that the 2 bodies of the merchants resurfaced, pointed towards John Wolfe. Although there was not a lot of evidence to actually point the finger at John, he had been a member of the crew when the ship placed anchor at the docks of London. John was arrested and caught with a large sum of money that was believed to have been stolen from the royal coffers, and this is what ultimately led to his imprisonment. You could not steal from the king, especially someone as brutal as King Henry VIII, and get away with it. It is important at this point to explain that John Board and William Dennis were guards in the Tower of London, and during his imprisonment, both Alice and John would get to know them very well. Alice would visit her husband almost daily for this time at the Tower, and over time John Wolfe began to see that John Board became a little too fond of Alice, and that is the weak spot they used to make John Wolfe's time in the Tower a little bit more bearable. Alice was also allowed to bring in good food and wine for her husband, something that he would have definitely not have received otherwise. Alice and John Wolfe managed to persuade John Board to smuggle items in that made his stay better than those who were imprisoned around him, and after 6 months of imprisonment, John was set free. The case surrounding him collapsed as there was a lack of evidence to support the claims. John Wolfe then, upon receiving a promise that John Board would take care of Alice, left the country and went to Ireland. Whilst John was away, new evidence would arise that linked him to the king's missing gold, and this new evidence also implicated his wife Alice. Even though Wolfe had been gone, both he and Alice were tried in their absence to avoid losing any time. Alice wasn't made aware of what was going on around her, and she still at this time was regularly seen around the Tower, as she had become very friendly with John Board. Within days, both Alice and Wolfe were tried and sentenced to death for treason, something that Alice, up until this point, knew nothing about. In February of 1534, Alice was arrested and placed into a cell with no windows, inside the Cold Harbour Tower, and the only light that came through would have been through the tiny barred window on the heavy oak cell door. She was shackled and chained to the walls, forced to wait for her husband to be arrested. Because Alice's treatment was incredibly harsh, the lieutenant of the Tower agreed that the chains could be removed as long as the cell door and outer door were kept locked at all times. William Dennis, an old friend of Alice, was then tasked with guarding her cell, and he was upset by what he saw. Dennis then began to bring in small treats and gifts for Alice, but this and his upset filtered back to the Tower's lieutenant, and Dennis was then fired from his position. Alice was now alone and scared. The Tower was a frightening place, especially for a woman, and the only escape from the terrors that filled the halls with the echoes of fellow prisoners' tortured screams were the visit that Alice received from John. His schedule had been changed, so that he now guarded her cell on a daily basis. Over time, the bond that the two shared developed into love, and they began to start making plans of their life together through the conversations they had through the cell door. Alice had heard of a possible escape route through the Cold Harbour Gate, and John, who by this time was besotted with Alice, agreed to help. John got more daring with his visits, and he is reported to have, on separate occasions, smuggled a wooden stick, oiled the cell doors, and then a copy of the key to the lock of the Cold Harbour Gate. He also smuggled in a rope to Alice. All these items were then hidden out of sight by Alice, as they awaited the night of the escape. The escape plans were then finalised, and 2 weeks later at 10 p.m, Alice, by the light of the moon, used the wooden stick to carefully and quietly knock the pins that held the gate shut, and then she unlocked the door. Praying that John's oiling of the hinges worked, she slowly opened the door. She then ran through the maze-like hallways of the Tower and avoided all the guards, passing prisoners who called out for her to free them. And then finally, she got to some stairs leading to a flat roof above Traitor's Gate. John was waiting for Alice on the roof of St. Thomas's Tower. John tied the rope to an iron hook, and after waiting for the guards to complete their rounds on the street opposite the moat, they then lowered themselves down onto a small wharf by Traitor's Gate and untied a boat that would normally be used to ferry in prisoners. They used the boat to cross the moat, and there they walked up the grass verge towards the homes of the guards of the Tower and their families. John had hired a couple of horses, and the plan was to go to his friend's house to hide for a couple of days. They would then leave London and head to Europe. But just as they were nearing the edge of the walk, Tower guards walked towards them, and John, praying they didn't recognise Alice, huddled her in close, and she dropped her head in a bid not to be seen. But one of the guards recognised both Alice and John, and took both her and John back to the Tower. There Alice was thrown in a cell. As the cell door bolted shut, she wept pitiful tears, for the dreams of marrying a well-respected and loyal warder of the Tower of London and a faithful servant to His Majesty the King were now over. John could be heard screaming in agony, for he had been placed in Little Ease, a cell that was neither big enough to stand up in or lay down in, and the prisoners were there forced to kneel in the cramped position, often for days at a time. Word then reached the guards that Alice's common-law husband had been arrested and was en route to the Tower. They found it somewhat fitting that Alice and John Wolfe should then both share the same fate. Both Alice and John Wolfe were led down to the bottom of the Tower at low tide, shackled to the wall and jeered at as they tried to climb the slippery banks to avoid the incoming tide. But it was no use. They both drowned as the tide got higher and higher on the 31st of March 1534. The tide would have been slow, and the realisation would have crept over them for hours as they helplessly waited for their fate as the water slowly began to climb and they could no longer hold their heads up any longer. But what happened to John Board? Initially he was questioned, but he, without torture, confessed everything, saying that he was driven to betray his king and his job by the love that he felt for Alice. He was then tortured as part of his punishment and left to suffer in ways that no prisoner had ever suffered. There is a place within the Tower which has been named as Little Ease, but it is debatable in the opinion of some historians if it is really where John Board was imprisoned. It is rather believed that John Board may have well been tortured by being forced into something called the Scavenger's Daughter, or Skeffington's Daughter, after the man who created it, but that was rarely used. But in John Board's case, anything is possible, for he was subjected to some horrible indignities before he was allowed to die. He was also racked for his part in the escape, and he would have felt severe pain, as his muscles ripped and his arms and legs were pulled from their sockets. John was left a broken man. He finally died from exposure when he was hung naked by his arms from the walls of the Tower. He was left there to rot as an example of what happens to those who turn traitor to the Tower. John's body was left on the side of the Tower for months, being picked at by the crows. He served as a reminder to anyone foolish enough to cross the king what would happen if you tried to escape the king's justice. After everything that happened, the recovery of the gold crowns was never recorded. Was this an elaborate cover-up, blaming two people of another's crime, or did they deserve the fate they faced? Was it a massive miscarriage of justice that led to the extremely gruesome and horrific end to the three individuals whose lives were intertwined? Anne had been taught to read as a child, so she read and reread the Bible. Anne then, through all of her learnings, developed a love of teaching evangelicals. And not being shy or scared to speak her mind, Anne shared her views with her husband and neighbours, but neither were happy with her talk. Lincolnshire was to be at the centre of the pilgrimage of grace, and it was a conservative place. It was diverse, and when Anne proposed to the people that she wanted to read the Bible there, they soon let the bishop know of their outrage. But the law changed in 1543, meaning that Anne would get to read their Bible, but as the Act in Advancement of Religion states, only in private. Only one priest made his thoughts known to Anne, but she claimed that she was unimpressed with his outburst, and therefore she could not remember what he had said to her. Anne, it seems, was in a very unhappy marriage, and Kyme was not rumoured to be a very nice person. So, when the Reformation came about, Anne used this as a chance to seek a divorce from Kyme. From her reading of the Bible, she believed that she had the right to divorce her husband. For example, she quoted St. Paul, "If a faithful woman have an unbelieving husband, which will not tarry with her, she may leave him." But Kyme, he grew tired of Anne and her belligerence, and took the advice of a local priest. Much to Anne's pleasure, he kicked her out of their home. Anne, with great excitement, took the opportunity and headed to London. She used the opportunity to try and seek an audience with the king to request the divorce, but her request was denied, and documents show that a spy was assigned to keep a close eye on her behaviour. There in London, she would then spread the word of the Protestant Bible. But because King Henry VIII ruled that any man or woman of anything lower than the lower of high-class society would be breaking the law if they read the Bible, and thus this made for someone to stand reciting the Bible for the ordinary people to be a heretic. But Anne would not be fazed, and there was no other way. She attended secret Bible meetings in London, and her next step would to be to listen to what the people of London wanted, and they wanted to hear Anne, so she felt duty-bound to deliver. Anne was an amazing gospeller, and people flocked from miles around to hear her. Protestant texts were read, and the public were in awe, enamoured that a woman of such high ranking would come to the streets and give herself to the poor. She soon earned the name the Fair Gospeller, and became somewhat of a Tudor celebrity. Anne knew that she was breaking the law, but the rebel that she had grew to be just didn't care, as her need to share the teachings of the Bible meant more. At some point Anne found that she was arrested and informed that her divorce request had been turned down, but after her arrest she escaped and soon returned to her passion in London. Anne was now starting to gain attention from people that wanted to do her harm because they didn't like what she stood for. One of these was a man called Stephen Gardiner. He was a trusted politician, and he didn't like that Anne was educating the poor with Protestant text. And he felt the only way to put an end to it would be to put an end to her. And Stephen also did not like Catherine Parr, Henry's sixth and final wife. She was also well educated and a devout Protestant, and Stephen thought that he could find a way to kill two birds with one stone. It seemed that both Anne and the Queen had a mutual friend, a noble woman called Catherine Brandon, and Stephen, seeing the connection between the two women, decided to use it to his advantage. Catherine Parr managed to get one step ahead and burn all of her Protestant texts, but Anne wasn't so lucky. She was arrested and taken to the Tower of London. She had been found with a book written by John Firth, a Protestant priest who was previously killed at the stake for heresy. She was interviewed by Edmund Bonner, the Bishop of London, who had obtained the nickname of Bloody Bonner because of his ruthless persecution of heretics. There she was questioned and asked to name all the other women heretics that she knew of, but Anne stayed silent. It was customary in Tudor England, when a prisoner was being questioned, to show a man being tortured and threaten that it would be them next if they did not comply. But because Anne was of high birth and a woman, where it was illegal to torture women in the Tower, it was deemed inappropriate. So unfortunately for Anne, Stephen decided to cut out the middle part, and Anne was put on the rack. Anne was eventually condemned to be executed by burning, but she had not implicated the Queen, and Stephen needed this to happen. Anne had decided to write about her time in the Tower, and explained that she was tortured on the rack. She explained that she was stripped down to her shift before being tied to the device. She was then stretched until she was taut and raised 5 inches from the table. Anne then explains that she passed out from the pain, but once revived, the whole ordeal was repeated twice more. Anne's torture, it seems, was too much for one man to bear. The Tower constable ran to the king to demand the torture stopped. But the 2 men that ordered the torture were Stephen Gardiner's right-hand men, Tom Worthesley and Richard Rich. Both ignored the request to end the suffering, and instead decided that if the torturer wouldn't torture, then they would do it themselves. The pain and suffering and violence was only put to an end when Anthony Kingston, the Tower's constable, returned with a royal demand. According to Askew, "Then they did put me on the rack, because I confessed no ladies or gentlemen to be of my opinion. The Lord Chancellor and Master Rich took pains to rack me with their own hands, till I was nearly dead. I fainted, and then they recovered me again. After that I sat 2 long hours arguing with the Lord Chancellor, upon the bare floor, With many flattering words, he tried to persuade me to leave my opinion. I said that I would rather die than break my faith. Anne was the only woman to have been tortured in the Tower, and she did not name a single other soul as an accomplice. Through her bravery and ability to stay silent, the Queen and her ladies were released as there was no evidence. No other woman had been tortured in the Tower of London due to the law, and some historians believe that Anne was tortured due to a sadistic or sexual reason, or just maybe because she was seen as a way to rid of the Queen. Anne was then held at Newgate Prison to await her execution. And then, on the 16th of July 1546, Anne was put to death by being burnt at the stake. Thousands flocked to witness the burning of the fair gospeller. But poor Anne had endured so much pain and injury due to the torture that she could no longer stand. Her body had been stretched so much that her tendons had snapped, her wrists, ankles, elbows, hips and knees had dislocated, and her muscle fibre had been stretched beyond repair. Anne, therefore, to be put to death by burning, had to be carried out on a chair. She was then transferred to another chair, where she was tied down with chains and attached to a wood pile, which was then set alight. But to make it worse, and with the aim of causing as much pain as they could, the fire was set to burn as slowly as possible. It is even thought that someone took pity on Anne and covered her in gunpowder to ensure a swift death, but other accounts report that the fire burned for over an hour. The only consistent report is that Anne, the brave warrior that she was, maintained her dignity and her courage until the very end. At the time of her death, a ferocious thunderstorm hit London, and many believe this to be a display of God's wrath for the murder of innocents. John Bale wrote that, "Credibly I am informed by various Dutch merchants who were present there, that in the time of their suffering, the sky and the abhorring so wicked an act suddenly altered colour, and the clouds from above gave a thunderclap, not unlike the one written in Psalm 76. The elements both declared wherein the high displeasure of God for so tyrannous a murder of innocents." The last to die a martyr under the reign of King Henry VIII, Anne Askew, was only 25 years old, and after her execution, Stephen Gardiner had a meeting with King Henry and raised concerns about his wife, the Queen, Catherine Parr. He stated that he had concerns about her religious beliefs and eventually got Henry's permission to arrest her and her 3 leading ladies-in-waiting. Henry then went to see Catherine to discuss the accusations, but Catherine, being quick-witted, replied, "In this and all other cases, to your Majesty's wisdom, as my only anchor, supreme head and governor here in earth, next under God." He reminded her that in the past she had discussed these matters. Catherine had an answer for that too. She had disputed with Henry in religion, and she said principally to divert his mind from the pain of his leg, but also to profit from her husband's own excellent learning, as displayed in his replies. Henry replied, "Is it even so, sweetheart, and tendered your arguments to no worse end? Then perfect friends we are now again, as ever at any time there heretofore." The next day soldiers arrived to arrest Catherine and her ladies, but Henry told them that he had changed his mind and sent them away. Anne Askew leaves behind a legacy, and she shall not be forgotten. She wrote a first-person account of her ordeal and her beliefs, which was published as The Examinations by John Bale, and later in John Fox's Acts and Monuments of 1563, which proclaims her as a Protestant martyr. Anne, a promise of a bright future, taken away by the death of her sister, and then an arranged marriage to a man she did not like or love. Anne found comfort and happiness preaching the Bible to the people.
It took just 17 days from her arrest for her to be put to death. She went from queen to outcast. But will Anne get her last-minute reprieve? At 2 a.m. on the 19th of May, the yeoman warders are patrolling the Tower of London, and inside Anne's apartments, nobody is asleep. It is said that Anne was surprising in her behaviour. She was almost cheery and laughing with her ladies. The constable of the Tower described Anne's mood as swinging between despair and hope. I have seen many men and also women executed, and all they have been in great sorrow. To my knowledge, this lady has much joy and pleasure in death. Does Anne still think that Henry will save her, or has she accepted her fate? Just 3 years ago, Anne's marriage had been arranged by Thomas Cromwell, but Anne, however, had failed to give Henry a son, and Anne and Cromwell were at loggerheads. Thomas Cromwell now needs Anne out of the way. All 5 men that were accused with Anne were executed on Tower Hill. Anne, however, is to now be the first person to be officially executed in a private execution in the Tower. So a scaffold needed building, and quickly. But why was there such a rush? The answer to that is Cromwell. He didn't want to give the king a chance to change his mind. In just hours he hoped to be rid of Anne. She had failed to give him a son, and he needed a male heir to continue the Tudor dynasty. Henry now had his eyes set on Jane Seymour. Jane was Anne's former lady-in-waiting, and she was next in line. She would replace her and give the king a new hope. And Cromwell is the mastermind behind it all. His next challenge was to ensure that Anne's daughter Elizabeth will never be queen. Henry also felt that a divorce would not suffice, and Cromwell needed to make sure that the marriage was annulled. Therefore, nothing could get in the way of a future male heir. 3 days previous, Cromwell had persuaded Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury, to write off the marriage. Cranmer said, "On the basis of some true, just and legitimate causes recently brought to our attention, the marriage was now void, and has always been so, which makes Anne's daughter, henceforth as we know Elizabeth, a bastard." This is another blow for the devastated Anne. Her legacy is destroyed, and Elizabeth now has no chance to claim the throne. But Thomas Cranmer was a firm supporter of Anne, as he was her personal confessor. If she had done anything wrong, she would have confessed, as she was deeply religious, and although he annulled the marriage, he is astounded at the charges. He is shocked and distraught. Cranmer even told Henry that he was amazed, for he never had a better opinion of women. Cranmer desperately hoped that the king would change his mind. But then Alexandra Alice, a close friend, arrived by boat to Cranmer in an agitated state. He said he had had a nightmare, and he told Cranmer in much detail. "It was revealed to me, whether I was asleep or awake, I know not. The Queen's neck after her head had been cut off, and this so plainly that I could count the nerves, veins, and the arteries." Cranmer saw this as a premonition, and he looked up to the sky and declared, "She who has been the Queen of England will today become a queen in heaven." Cranmer is then utterly overcome with grief, and time is running out, and Anne is now just 6 hours from execution. At dawn, Anne was in her apartments, and she is with her chaplain receiving her final communion. But something you may not know is that this is a repeat of what happened the day before, when Anne was supposed to be executed. It had been postponed not once, but twice. One theory is that Cromwell was worried that there would be protests at the Tower in support of Anne. People began to mutter against the guilty verdict, and Cromwell needed time to have them removed from the Tower before the execution. Anne must have felt mentally tortured. It is said that hope is harder to deal with than despair. I can only imagine that Anne still had feelings that the king would change his mind and save her. Come 5 a.m. and Anne is still in her apartments, and she was preparing to face the world for the last time. Her ladies-in-waiting are distraught as they assist Anne with getting dressed. Anne had carefully selected each item of her clothing to send a message to those watching her execution. She wore a red kirtle, or underdress if you like. Wearing a red underdress or petticoat was normal for those of the lower class, and it is thought that Anne wore red to appear humble. Anne was educated in France, and her French flamboyant and colourfully rich clothing is something that she was famed for. But Anne chose a much more subdued outer gown. She wore black and grey, the colours of piety and sobriety. It is thought that Anne was trying to come across as meek, something that she was not known to be. Historians believe that by Anne dressing down, she was using the last of her armoury to try and get out of the situation and save herself from death. Anne had been convicted of treason, which is punishable by death, but the jury did not mention the method of execution. You see, a Queen of England had never before been sentenced to death, so this was new territory. In the National Archives lies a document that provides an insight into how the decision was made. In this 500-year-old book is a record of the execution warrant for Anne Boleyn, and this warrant sets out how she was to die. A woman under the Treason Act would have been burned, and a man would have been hung, drawn and quartered. But the document reveals that for Anne, Henry had chosen an alternative method of execution. We, moved by pity, not wishing the Lady Anne to be burned, direct the constable of the Tower that on the green within the Tower of London the said Anne shall have her head cut from her body. Henry then ordered a sword instead of an axe, because a blunt axe could take multiple blows to decapitate a person, and a sword was swift. However, when Anne is informed of Henry's decision, she shows her dark sense of humour. Anne puts her hands around her neck and says, "It will be a swift death, for I have just a little neck." The instructions for Anne's execution were sent to the Tower just the day before, and this gave the Constable of the Tower, Sir William Kingston, little time to prepare. The document shows the unprecedented nature of it all, for Anne Boleyn was the first Queen of England to be executed, and they needed to get it right. But this document also left an instruction manual for any future wife of Henry VIII. Beheading by sword is actually a French method of execution. Henry summoned an expert swordsman from Saint-Omer in France. The swordsman had been at the Tower just 24 hours previous, and he would shortly have the daunting task of being the first man to execute an English queen. However, what is interesting is the time frames. It would have taken at least 3 days to travel from London to Dover, across the sea to Calais, and then a bit further to Saint-Omer, and then it would have taken a further 3 days for the swordsman to travel back. That's a minimum of 6 days. What this means is that the swordsman must have been summoned before the trial had reached a verdict, just 5 days previous. No matter what Anne said or did, her fate had been sealed. Anne's execution was meant to be a private affair, to A, preserve her modesty and dignity, and B, prevent anyone from rescuing her. Therefore, the public were ordered to leave the Tower, but unfortunately the gates had been accidentally left unlocked, and crowds were gathering in the anticipation of the execution. A question I find myself asking is, why would a person come to watch another person's execution? I put this down to society's fascination with the grim and morbid aspects of the world. Anne's uncle was present, as was the king's illegitimate son, Henry Fitzroy. Was Fitzroy there to remind Anne that Henry was in fact able to father a son? Then the architect, Thomas Cromwell, appeared. He was about to witness the concluding part of his plan, and everything was now in place for the execution of Anne Boleyn. Sir William Kingston then headed to the Queen's apartments to summon Anne, and her time was running out. Anne is dressed and waiting to be called. The Constable of the Tower is responsible for making sure that Anne's execution goes to plan, and with the time approaching, he headed over to collect her. When Kingston arrives at Anne's door, I can only imagine what Anne must have been feeling. On one hand, it's what she has been dreading all along. Perhaps she is still hoping that against the odds, Kingston has come with a message from Henry to say that he has come to his senses and she will be saved. But those hopes are soon shattered, because Kingston then told her to make ready for her execution. Anne replied calmly, "Acquit yourself of your charge, for I have long been prepared." Anne was so extraordinarily ready to meet her fate, and it is certainly a testament to her character. Ambassador Chapuis remarked that Anne was braver than a lion. Words never more true than on the last day of her life. Henry, however, was at his palace in Whitehall, and there was no sign that he would change his mind. He had been dressed by his gentlemen, and was listening out for the firing of cannons, a signal that Anne was dead and he was free to remarry. Anne was then led by Sir William Kingston from the sanctuary of her apartments and through Cold Harbour Gate, and then onto the scaffold on the other side of the White Tower, where she was to be executed. Anne was accompanied by her 4 ladies in waiting. Anne's story had come full circle, for the last time she was here was just 3 years ago for her coronation. Anne was then met by a procession of 200 yeomen of the King's Guard, followed by the officers of the Tower and her chaplain. She is then escorted around the corner to the scaffold, which she then sees for the first time. The crowd is silent as she walks through them, and people then comment that she has never looked more beautiful. With time running out, Anne is looking around, hoping for a royal pardon, but it does not come. Anne then spots familiar faces in the crowds of the men who raised her to become queen. Her uncle and Thomas Cromwell, there to witness the destruction of her power and influence. Kingston then helps Anne up the steps to the scaffold, and she then turns to her ladies who are sobbing, and she comforts them. Anne then sees the executioner. He looks apprehensive at what he is about to do, but Anne does not see the sword, for it is hidden beneath the straw on the scaffold, and this was done as not to alarm her. Anne then asks Kingston for permission to speak. It is said that Anne did not look like someone who was about to be executed. Witnesses said that she was smiling, and then with a cheerful countenance she turned and addressed the crowds. "Good Christian people, I am come hither to die, for according to the law and by the law I am judged to die, and therefore I will speak nothing against it. I come hither to accuse no man, nor speak anything of that whereof I am accused, and condemned to die. But I pray God save the King, and send him long to reign over you. For a gentler nor a more merciful prince was there never, and to me he was ever a good, a gentle, and sovereign lord. And if any person will meddle of my cause, I require them to judge the best. And thus I take my leave of the world, and of you all, and I heartily desire you all to pray for me. O Lord, have mercy on me. To God I condemn my soul." As Anne spoke, her words reduced many in the crowd to tears. It is believed that Anne's words were to try and get the king to look kindly on those she left behind, especially their daughter, Elizabeth. Anne was then invited to confess the truth, but Anne replied, "I know I shall have no pardon, for they shall know no more from me." Anne then maintained her innocence right to the very end. The swordsman then took off his shoes, an act that meant Anne would not hear him approach. Anne then removed her headdress, and her ladies handed her a linen cap. She then tucked her hair inside, so it would not get in the way of the sword. Then, at 9 a.m, the executioner stepped forwards and knelt before Anne. He begged her for forgiveness for what he was about to do, and he then asked Anne to kneel and say her prayers. The crowd then fell to their knees. Anne repeated several times, "To Jesu Christ I commend my soul. Lord Jesu, receive my soul." Then, with Anne Boleyn knelt down on the scaffold, the executioner picked up his sword. Anne's eyes were blindfolded, and she said, "Jesu, have pity on my soul." The swordsman then signals to an assistant who makes a noise to distract Anne, and then the executioner, whose hands were trembling with distress, swings his sword twice over his head to gain momentum, and then, with one swift swing, he severs Anne's head. Anne's head then fell to the straw on the scaffold. Horrified eyewitnesses claimed they could see her lips still moving in silent prayer. People began to weep, and the Queen of England was now dead. One of Anne's ladies then bravely picked up her head and covered it with a linen cloth. The other 3 ladies, distressed but refused to let any man touch her, so they picked up her body, and together they carried Anne away. At 9:05, cannons then fire and announced that the Queen of England was dead. Henry heard the cannons and took no time to mourn his loss. Instead, he immediately made his way to the waiting Jane Seymour. At the Tower of London, Anne's body was then laid to rest, but not in a coffin. Instead, Anne's body is placed into an arrow chest, which was taken from the Tower's weaponry. But why did Anne not have a proper coffin? Was it simply due to the lack of time, or was it down to another reason? William Kingston, Constable of the Tower, was responsible for making all the arrangements, but did he, like Anne, believe that Henry would not really go through with it? Anne's body was then taken to the Tower Chapel, where it was stripped of all of her jewellery and expensive yet blood-stained clothes. Incredibly, Anne's clothes and jewels were then to be passed by Henry to his new wife, Anne's replacement, Jane Seymour. Then, at midday, just 3 hours after Anne's execution, she is buried in the chancel next to her brother George. Almost 500 years after her death, Anne is still remembered, and on the anniversary of her death, a bouquet of red roses is left on her grave, a reminder that she is still in the hearts and minds of those she is remembered by. Thomas Cromwell had pulled off a massive coup in executing Anne. He had not only eliminated the Queen of England, but all of her faction as well. Cromwell then went on to be the second most powerful man in England, but no one is safe in the Tudor court, and in a twist of fate he fell from Henry's favour, and 4 years later Thomas Cromwell met the axe. But Anne's already sad story gets worse. After her execution, Henry and Thomas Cromwell tried to erase her from living history. All of her letters, portraits, initials and emblems were destroyed and removed, but no matter how they tried, there was one thing they could not remove: Even though Anne was queen for only 3 years, she left England with one of its greatest legacies. Just 22 years later, against all the odds, her daughter became Queen Elizabeth I, and she ruled for 44 years. And Elizabeth never forgot her mother. She wore a ring with a great secret. Inside this ring was 2 portraits. On one side was Anne Boleyn, and the other, Elizabeth. A tiny yet intricate devotion to her mother. A ring that was only taken off on the deathbed of Elizabeth. And the ring was made from mother of pearl, an illustration of her love for her mother. When you strip back all of the lies and rumours that have surrounded Anne for the past 500 years, you see how groundless the claims were, and you realise that Anne was courageous and brave throughout the scariest part of her life. Henry then, just 11 days after the execution of Anne, married Jane Seymour. And Cromwell, after Anne's execution, declared that just 12 days before her death, he had feigned an illness and retired from court to plot her downfall. Henry VIII was a brute, and the men doing his bidding knew all too well how to carry out his will. Poor Catherine had admitted to adultery and premarital sex, and when the law changed and the Royal Assent by Commission Act 1541 was introduced, it meant there was no need for a trial, and the evidence was stacked against the helpless Catherine Howard, who was then sentenced to death. Catherine had been found guilty of committing treason against the king by having an adulterous affair with Thomas Culpeper, a man who was close to Henry. Initially, Catherine spent her imprisonment at Sion Abbey, but then, after 2 months, Lords of the Council came to fetch Catherine from Sion on the 10th of February 1542. At this point, Catherine had spent 2 months a prisoner, and her reaction was one of pure panic. Of course, Catherine knew what to expect, and that absolutely terrified her. Catherine was told that she would now be taken to the Tower of London, and it was at this point that she cried with all her might. She screamed and she tried to fight them off. But this was no use, as Catherine was taken by force and in a rough manner to a barge that would then transport her to the Tower of London down the River Thames. Catherine, then already scared out of her mind and petrified of what lied ahead, was taken under London Bridge. It was here that she saw the heads of Francis Dereham and Thomas Culpeper, her 2 apparent former lovers. Both men had been tried and convicted of high treason, and the trial for Thomas Culpeper and Francis Dereham subsequently led them to being executed at Tyburn. Henry Manox was incredibly lucky to escape this fate, for Manox was questioned and admitted that he had been employed by the Duchess Agnes to teach Catherine music and singing, and admitted having tried to seduce Catherine, but the Privy Council felt that he had committed no crime and released him. On the 10th of December 1541, Thomas Culpeper was beheaded, but Francis Dereham was hung, drawn and quartered. Then, as customary for the time, both men had their heads placed onto spikes and displayed on London Bridge as a warning to the City of London that treason, especially against the king, was no laughing matter. Then, once Catherine had arrived at the Tower of London, she entered through Traitor's Gate and was led to her prison cell. The following morning she would learn that her execution was scheduled for 7 a.m. on Monday the 13th of February 1542, and that she had just 3 more days to live. Catherine Howard was told to dispose of her soul and prepare for death. She was to die at 9 o'clock the next morning. The night before her execution, Catherine spent hours praying. She is also thought to have practised placing her head onto the block, and according to Eustace Chapuis, Catherine requested the block be brought to her so that she might know how to place herself. Her request was granted, and the block was brought into her chamber. On the morning of February 13th, Catherine woke early and made her way out of the apartment she was imprisoned in and towards the scaffold that had been erected for her execution. It is said that as Catherine approached, she was terrified and pale. She was petrified of what was coming next, so much so that she needed help to climb the stairs. Once on the scaffold, Catherine was so weak that she could hardly speak, but she said that she had merited 100 deaths for so offending the king who had so graciously treated her. It is also said that she then asked all Christian people to take regard unto her worthy and just punishment of death, for her offences and heinously from her youth upward in breaking all of his commandments, and also against the king's royal majesty very dangerously. There is a rumour throughout history that states the following. When Catherine was on the scaffold, she said, "I die a queen, but I would rather die the wife of Culpeper." Catherine was so weak that she struggled to speak. The fear had overtaken her. The executioner then gave Catherine a blindfold, which she then placed over her eyes. Then, as Catherine had practised the night before, she knelt down and placed her head on the block. There was a large crowd there to witness her death, and as the executioner raised the extremely sharp axe, the crowd gasped. Then, with one swift blow, the executioner struck Catherine's neck and removed her head from her body. It was at this point that the executioner picked up Catherine's head by her hair and removed her blindfold. He held her head up to the crowd and showed her lifeless face and proclaimed, "God save the King." Catherine was then taken by her ladies, after being covered with a black cloak, to the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, where she was then laid to rest. But the day was not over, for Catherine Howard's lady-in-waiting, Jane Boleyn, or Lady Rochford if you like, was next. Jane had confessed to helping facilitate the meetings between Catherine and Thomas Culpeper. Catherine Howard was only around the age of 18 when she was killed. She had risen to Queen of England in such a short time, and after only a year and a half, she was then executed for treasonous adultery. Her fall from grace is a very sad and disturbing story, for she was just a young girl that had been used and abused whilst in the care of her step-grandmother, and then placed into the employ of Henry VIII, where her life choices led her down a very dangerous path. Catherine has been remembered in history as being the 5th wife to Henry, but she should also be remembered for being brave, courageous, and facing her demons on her last day on this earth.
Jane Boleyn was only a Boleyn through marriage, but she had links to the royal court in a multitude of ways: sister-in-law to Queen Anne Boleyn, and the lady-in-waiting to Queen Catherine Howard, and she even had some distant relation to the king, making her family quite active politically. Jane's reputation in history paints her as evil and a wicked wife, and some contemporary accounts note her as the infamous Lady Rochford, stating she deserved her fate for the involvement which she had in bringing Anne Boleyn, as well as her own husband, to the block. But her reputation of being evil and spiteful only came in the years after her death. Jane Boleyn died on the 13th of February 1542 at the hands of the executioner on the scaffold on Tower Green at the Tower of London. She was condemned to death for her part and involvement in the affair of Catherine Howard and Thomas Culpeper, a trusted courtier of King Henry VIII. Some believed that her death was a way of her past actions catching up with her. Lady Rochford, Jane Boleyn, was the widow of George Boleyn, brother to Anne Boleyn. Jane's part in history remains somewhat controversial, and the centuries have not been kind to her. History dictates that Jane Boleyn was a wicked and jealous wife who provided false testimony against her husband and sister-in-law, testimony that enabled the deaths of Anne and George. Jane was born Jane Parker to Henry Parker, the 10th Baron Morley, and Alice St. John. Her date of birth is unknown, but realistic guesses place it around 1505. Jane first met her sisters-in-law, Anne and Mary Boleyn, when she was chosen to have a part in a masked play in the court at 1522. Jane played the role of Constancy, Anne Boleyn was Perseverance, Mary Boleyn was Kindness, and the king's sister, Mary, was Beauty. Jane then went on to marry George at some point in 1524, it's believed, and two prominent families merged. Now there are rumours that George Boleyn was homosexual, but any evidence to prove this doesn't actually exist. Instead, the more accepted answer is that George, a self-proclaimed sinner, merely committed adultery and had an affair with another woman. Rumours circled that his marriage was unhappy, and the man responsible for any such rumours of homosexuality was in the employ of Cardinal Wolsey, George Cavendish, and Cavendish believed that the Boleyns were responsible for his master's downfall. Cavendish did not respect the Boleyns, so it's highly reasonable to believe that he lied and exaggerated about certain matters. It's believed that the real cause for tension between George and Jane was actually religion. David Lode states, "There is no sign that Jane was anything other than strictly orthodox in her faith, and she had no patronage of any significance to indicate otherwise, while George was clearly in the evangelical camp." David Lode's The Boleyns, The Rise and Fall of a Tudor Dynasty, page 141. George, like his sister Anne, developed an interest in religious reform, but Jane, on the other hand, was a devout Catholic. Her father, Lord Morley, spent a few years in Margaret Beaufort's household. He was the mother of Henry VII, and he came to know John Fisher, who was executed in 1535 for refusing to accept Henry VIII as the supreme head of the church. Perhaps Jane's family, like many people in England, blamed Anne Boleyn for the executions of both John Fisher and Sir Thomas More. Jane and George married long before Anne even contemplated being queen, but Jane became a lady-in-waiting to Anne, and it's unknown how the two felt about each other. But that being said, Jane conspired with Anne against the king's new mistress, and she found herself banished from court for a time. This incident likely strained the relationship between the two women. Jane's presence is then recorded in court again in 1535, when the then Princess Mary had left Greenwich to go to Eltham. A great many women, in spite of their husbands, had flocked to see her pass and had cheered her, calling out that, notwithstanding all laws to the contrary, she was still their princess. Several of them, being higher rank than the rest, had been sent to the Tower. On the margin of that report, written by Dinterville himself, "Note my Lord Rochford." The ambassador clearly meant that Lady Rochford was among those who had cheered Mary. This is taken from Anne Boleyn, A Chapter of English History, page 128 by Paul Friedman. Now it's believed that Jane may have felt torn between her family and her husband's family. Her loyalty and her beliefs were split. She was a Catholic, and the bloody executions of individuals that she admired and looked up to, like Bishop Fisher and Sir Thomas More, would have shocked her to her core. This must have caused such a tremendous tension between Jane, her husband, and the rest of the Boleyns. Jane then, according to local legends, became filled with jealousy, as her husband had such a close relationship with his sister Anne, and because of this she gave a false testimony, a testimony that sent them both to their deaths. Wicked wife, accuser of her own husband, even to the seeking of his own blood. George Wyatt. Now, did Jane really testify against her own husband, against her sister-in-law, the Queen? In the reports and dispatches from the time, it states, "That person who, more out of envy and jealousy than out of love towards the king, did betray this accused secret, and together with it the names of those who had joined in the evil doings of the unchaste Queen." There's no mention about Jane Boleyn, only that the person is held responsible for Queen Anne Boleyn's downfall. At George's trial, it's reportedly said that, "On the evidence of only one woman, you are prepared to believe this great evil of me." Again, there was no mention of Jane, only a mysterious one woman. Bishop Burnet, who was probably the one who had access to contemporary sources that are now lost to us, stated that Jane carried many stories to the king, or some about him. However, there is no contemporary evidence that names Jane Boleyn as her husband's accuser. She is not mentioned by name, and it was only years after her death that she became labelled as evil, wicked, jealous and spiteful. Now, Julia Fox states in her writing about Jane that once Anne Boleyn's daughter, Elizabeth I, was queen, an explanation was needed for why Henry VIII had sent Anne to her death for treason and incest. Just as Elizabeth's mother, herself a Protestant icon by then, must have been innocent of the charges, the Queen's father, it was thought, would not have ordered Anne's execution unless he had believed her guilty. Now, conveniently, ignoring Henry's passion for Jane Seymour, it was easy to suggest that the king had been told lies, and that the person who had told the lies, it was alleged, was Jane. Executed for the alleged treason, and with no one to speak for her, she then became the perfect scapegoat. It was a myth, it seems. Jane was a historical scapegoat for Henry VIII and his desire to be rid of Anne. After the death of George, Jane was in financial difficulty and she found herself asking for help from Cromwell, Henry VIII's right-hand man, beseeching him to obtain from the king for her the stuff and plate of her husband. The king and her father paid 2,000 marks for her jointure to the Earl of Wiltshire, and she is only assured of 100 marks during the Earl's life, which is very hard for me to shift the world withal. Praise to him to inform the king of this. Soon after this, Jane then found herself back at court as the lady of the bedchamber to Jane Seymour, third wife to Henry VIII, and Jane then held this position with Henry's subsequent wives right up until her execution in 1542. Now, Jane is falsely reported as admitting her guilt for giving false testimony against her husband, but actually, according to a witness, Otwell Johnson, Jane only said the following: "Committed many sins against God from my youth upwards, and have offended the King's royal majesty very dangerously, so my punishment is just and deserved. I am justly condemned by the laws of this realm and by Parliament. All of you who watch me die should learn from my example and change your own lives. You must gladly obey the King in all things, for he us a just and godly prince. I pray for his preservation and beseech you all to do the same. I now entrust my soul to God and pray for his mercy." Jane was executed on the same day as Queen Catherine Howard, and Otwell wrote of them afterwards how impressed with their dignity he was. Their souls must be with God, for they made the most godly and Christian end. Jane was, after her death, given the label of evil, but perhaps it was just her own nosy nature that brought on her downfall. She did conspire with Anne Boleyn in order to get rid of the king's new mistress in 1534. She did show her support for the Lady Mary in 1535, when it was clearly a very risky thing to do, and she was briefly taken to the Tower on that account. And she helped a teenage queen, Catherine Howard, organise and facilitate her secret liaisons with Thomas Culpeper. But did she give false testimony against her husband and sister-in-law? I guess we'll never really know the truth. She was found guilty of high treason and taken to the Tower, where she suffered a nervous breakdown. Perhaps Jane thought that this last act of desperation would save her from the traitor's death, but she was wrong. Henry VIII was eager to put her to death, and he implemented a law that permitted the insane to be executed. Upon the scaffold, Jane showed no signs of being mentally insane. Instead, she faced her death with courage and dignity.